Today, we're going to cover 5 tactics for de-stressing your performance review cycle. Now, we need to be honest about performance reviews because there are a lot of downsides, right? There are significant time investment. And if you don't do them well, the impact is going to be questionable. They create a ton of distraction and anxiety for HR admins, for managers, for direct reports, really everybody. And it can lead people to question the qualifications of the raters or the reviewers, right? So it could potentially damage some relationships on the team. That said, the downsides of not reviewing performance are actually quite a bit worse, right? So you might have people on your team who you think are doing good work. I think Will is doing good work. I'm pretty sure. Or good old Lisa, remember that big deal she closed 2 quarters ago? Or Tanya is perfect for her role. There's no need to check whether she's ready for new responsibilities or the next step in her career. Or I'm sure Beth feels recognized and appreciated. She's happy here and won't look for another job. And so the outcome is, even though you think everything is going fine or great, if you're not reviewing performance in a formal way, you'll probably have some underperformers on your team, or maybe some people who are kind of just coasting along, or other people feel stuck at their current level, or maybe some people feel unappreciated and they may be looking for a role elsewhere. And a good performance review experience is going to solve all of these problems. So how do we make sure that we're doing performance reviews in the right way and not stressing everybody out as a result? So let's take a look at 5 different tactics to do that. And as we go through each tactic, consider to what extent are you living into each of these on your team. The first tactic is to help your managers continuously measure performance. Now, continuous measurement processes are used successfully by companies like Google, Netflix, Adobe, Salesforce, and many others. And what we mean by continuous measurement is 2 things. So first, it means measuring a balanced array of performance indicators. So yes, OKRs and KPIs. But how are you measuring other things, like the extent to which somebody lives into your team values? You talk about your team or company values all the time, but are you measuring how well people are living into those? Are your managers measuring their direct reports' accomplishments? So is there something that somebody did this quarter or this year that deserves really special recognition? Are your managers measuring stretch? So meaning the extent to which somebody is stretching outside of their comfort zone or pushing themselves to be better? How are you and your organization measuring habits at work? So for example, if somebody's consistently handing in work a few days after a deadline, or conversely, if somebody's doing really well, they're consistently preparing really well for customer presentations. How are those habits being taken into account? And then how are you measuring other contributions to the team that don't show up in KPIs? Like how helpful is somebody to other team members? So how are you measuring these things and how are you incorporating them into performance reviews, right? And you're going to be finding these bits of information in lots of different places. Ideally, your managers are collecting them both in a formal tool, project management tool, like something like Asana or Jira and so forth, and also in more informal ways like taking notes during one-on-ones. Now, the second tactic is to set expectations for exactly how the performance review meeting is going to go, not having it be a free-for-all, because a lot of the stress and anxiety comes from not knowing what to expect. And though that's going to be there to some extent, we can still set clear expectations, both for managers and for direct reports. So the way we think about performance reviews is that they actually combine 2 things: a presentation by the manager of the review, and then a conversation between the manager and the direct report about the rating and the context behind it. Now, you can organize these elements in different ways. One way you can do it, for example, is to ask for reactions as you go. So to kind of pepper in conversation throughout the presentation portion. So after you check in, you might summarize someone's strengths. Here's what I noticed this quarter that you're doing really well. And then you ask for reactions. You have a conversation about that. How did that land and so forth. Then you move on to areas for improvement. Another thing you can do is just reserve time for reactions to the end. So you might spend 20 minutes laying out your review. These things you're doing really well. These are the areas for improvement. Here are some of my overall rating decisions and so forth, and then have a longer conversation about it. Or if you send a written review in advance of the meeting, you can ask for reactions right off the bat. People will tend to have burning thoughts if they've seen their review already prior to the meeting. So you might want to ask for reactions earlier on. And there are lots of specific questions that we include in our training to help people do this. But just to give you an example of a breakdown of just the check-in section. So you want to spend about 5 minutes checking in. And what that might look like is asking, hey, how are you feeling today? Confirming that this is still a good time to do the debrief. And then finally laying out, here's how I'd like to structure the meeting so it's not a surprise for your direct report when they're going to get a chance to chime in, and so forth. Our third tactic is to help managers prepare to encounter defensive or difficult reactions, because a lot of times constructive feedback is going to be perceived as an attack. It might trigger the fight or flight response. And this may lead direct reports to freeze or mentally check out of the conversation or refuse to accept feedback and so forth. So it's really important for you as an admin or as a manager to prepare for that so you can stay calm and open and help make the conversation productive wherever it goes. And so there are a few different things that we include in our training on this sort of thing. One is, if your direct report is surprised or disagrees, there are some tactics. One is to ask for details. Hey, I see that you feel differently about this. What makes you say that? What do you consider inaccurate or unfair? And then further, to have your own details. Here's more context for why I gave you this rating or for why I answered the question in this way. And then finally, trying to get people to focus in on the future. Let's talk about what you will need to do in the next evaluation period to get the rating you had hoped for. Now, ideally, your feedback isn't coming as a surprise because you're giving a lot of feedback throughout the year, but probably some of it is going to be surprising, and some of it might lead people to feel really emotional. And so if that happens, if your direct report gets very emotional, some of the things that we train people to do is to use active listening. Hey, it sounds like you feel this way because you really need or value this other thing. To show empathy, I totally understand where you're coming from. And then if emotions are still running high, it probably is going to make sense to suggest to end the meeting for now, to give each other space and reschedule to another time, probably in your next one-on-one. The fourth tactic is to dedicate separate time for a follow-up plan. And the reason that we want to do this is just consider the emotions that are at play at in this meeting, right? If you're a direct report, maybe you just found out what your rating is. If you got a lower rating than expected, you may be confused or upset. If you got a really great rating, you might be euphoric. Either way, you're unlikely to be in a state where you're thinking totally rationally or in a long-term way. And if you're a manager, maybe you do want to jump in right away with recommendations. Hey, I think this is how you need to improve, but you want to give your direct report time to process what they've just heard and come up with their own ideas for what to do in the future, right? What we want to avoid is at the end of that meeting, both of you being, hey, glad I don't have to think about that for another year. We don't want the performance review to just be this meeting that we have and then nothing comes of it, right? In a lot of ways, the follow-up is actually what gives the performance review process its meaning. So what we recommend is to have a totally separate follow-up process, separate from the meeting. So you're going to do your performance review meeting. You're going to allude to the fact that there's going to be a path forward, but over the next few days after the meeting, there's going to be reflection both by you as a manager and by the direct report of what to do. And I'll show you in a moment some of the questions that you can ask that are part of that reflection. Then you're going to get together in a one-on-one meeting to align on that path forward. And then there's ongoing maintenance. So to give you an example of some of the questions that you're asking after the performance review meeting, for missed expectations, what do you think is going to help you get back on track? For things that were met or exceeded, what things do you think will help you do even better? How do you plan on putting the feedback from this performance review into practice? How can I help you do that effectively? Are there any activities that align with your strengths that you should be doing more of? Or maybe activities that you think you should be doing less of without compromising team goals? And finally, going forward, what can I do better as a manager to support you? Now, you would literally be sending these questions out for your direct report to answer. If you take a look at these, you can understand how much rich information you can get as a result. And it makes sense to ask these kind of questions once a year or twice a year. Finally, what we recommend to de-stress the process is to provide training on the process itself to both managers and to individual contributors. In our classes, we help people role play difficult conversations. We help them plan out the meeting itself, right? What's happening in the different sections of the meeting. And we're doing it crucially at the point of need. So if you have performance reviews in December, don't do training in July, right? And in fact, break out the training sessions or resources that you're sending out to people so that they make sense of the different stages of the process. So for example, maybe you might do a class on continuous measurement right now, And then when your performance review process kicks off, it makes sense to tie that to a training session just on evaluation. So you do a training session just on evaluation when the evaluations are due. And then when the meetings are about to happen, you can do training on how to do the meetings. When the follow-up is going to happen, you can do training on how to do the follow-up. At the same time, consider offering that training for the direct reports, for the individual contributors, training on how to receive feedback, how to advocate for yourself. At the very least, provide an information session about how this process is going to run, and then let people ask questions in a public forum or privately, right? Part of a commitment to being inclusive, which probably a lot of you have in your organizations, is to give all of your people the skills to ask for feedback, to vouch for themselves, etc., so that it's not just people who see themselves in the upper rungs of the corporation who are comfortable asking for feedback or comfortable advocating for themselves. So that was 5 tips. We are helping managers continuously measure performance. We are also setting expectations for the performance review meeting structure, so it's not just a free-for-all, right? We also want to help our managers to prepare to encounter defensive or difficult reactions, which are going to be really common. We want to dedicate separate time for a follow-up plan, so we're not in a rush to talk about what's happening over the next 6 months or over the next year in the last few minutes of our performance review debrief. And then finally, we want to provide training to our managers and to individual contributors so everyone knows what to expect and they have less stress and anxiety about the process.